Chapter 1. The Daily Bread. In the heart of every town, there is a place that serves as its true center, a place that measures the pulse of the community, not in commerce or law, but in the steady, life-affirming rhythms of daily existence. In the town of Redemption, a quiet settlement nestled beside a river that ran clear and patient, that center was a bakery. It was called simply the Daily Bread, and its soul was a woman named Esther Thornton. At 69, Esther was not merely a baker, she was a town institution. Her hair was the color of flour dusted with moonlight, her eyes a warm, gentle brown like a perfectly baked loaf, and her hands, though gnarled with arthritis and marked by a lifetime of work, moved with a deep ancestral wisdom. They knew the exact moment to pull the bread from the oven, the precise feel of a properly kneaded dough, the delicate touch required for a birthday cake's frosted rose. Her bakery was a sanctuary of the senses. It smelled of yeast and melting butter of cinnamon and simmering fruit, of the comforting foundational scent of baking bread that permeated the very wood of the building. For the people of Redemption, the aroma wafting from the daily bread was the smell of home. It was the first thing they smelled in the morning and the last comforting scent of the evening. Esther's life was one of routine and purpose. She rose before the sun, her movements a familiar liturgy in the quiet of her kitchen. She fed her sourdough starter a living, breathing entity she called Matilda, that was older than most of the town's children. She kneaded, shaped and baked her work a form of prayer, a daily act of nourishment for the community she loved. She was a widow, her beloved husband, Samuel, having passed a decade prior. They had built this bakery together, his strong hands, building the shelves, and her clever hands creating the recipes. Now her only family was Bee, a quiet, bright-eyed girl of 17 whom Esther had taken in 3 years ago. Bee was an orphan, a distant relative of a friend left with nowhere to go. In Esther's warm kitchen she had found not just a home, but a calling. Esther was teaching her everything: how to read the dough, how to listen to the oven, how to understand that baking was not just about ingredients, but about intention. In Bay, Esther saw the future of the daily bread, a continuation of the legacy of care. More than just a baker, Esther was the town's unofficial historian, though she would never have used such a grand term. Her history was not written in books, but in a large grease-stained leather ledger that lay on her counter. It was her recipe book, but it was so much more. Each recipe was tied to a person, a family, an event. There was Mrs. Gable's morning loaf, a dense, dark rye bread she had created to comfort the postmistress after the loss of her husband. There was the Rodriguez family's celebration cornbread, a recipe shared with her by the first Mexican family to settle in the valley, a staple at every wedding and baptism. There was little Timmy's courage cookies, small gingerbread men she baked for a boy facing a frightening surgery. The recipe ledger was the heart of the town, a chronicle of its joys, sorrows, and simple everyday moments. Esther believed that food was memory, and in her small corner of the world, she was the keeper of those memories. Her life was a peaceful cycle of baking, mentoring, and serving a life of quiet, profound contentment. She thought it would always be so. But even the warmest kitchen can feel a chill when a cold wind blows from the outside world. Chapter 2. The Man with the Polished Words. The wind arrived in the form of a man named Mr. Julian Croft. He came to Redemption not on a dusty horse, but on the afternoon stagecoach, dressed in a tweed suit that spoke of Eastern universities and intellectual pursuits. He was a man in his 40s, with a handsome scholarly face, spectacles that glinted with intelligence, and a voice as smooth and persuasive as warm honey. He announced his purpose at a town meeting held in the modest town hall. He was a historian, a writer, commissioned by a wealthy patron in Philadelphia to write the definitive history of redemption. His project, he explained, was to be a grand biography of the town, a book that would be published back east and would cement redemption's place in the great story of the American West. He spoke of legacy, of immortalizing the town's pioneers, of creating a document that would make their children and grandchildren proud. The town was captivated. In an age of relentless forward movement, the idea of preserving their past, of having their humble lives deemed worthy of a book, was a powerful and seductive notion. The town council, led by Mayor Thompson, eagerly offered him their full cooperation. Mr. Croft was given an office in the town hall and access to all official records. Esther watched the proceedings from the back of the hall, a flicker of unease disturbing her usual calm. There was something about Mr. Croft's polished words that felt too smooth, too perfect. He spoke of history as a grand heroic narrative, a story of strong men and noble deeds. Esther knew that real history was messier than that. It was made of calloused hands, quiet heartbreaks, and the simple, unsung resilience of ordinary people. Over the next few weeks, Julian Croft became a fixture in the town. He was charming, inquisitive, and tireless. He spent his days interviewing the town's more prominent citizens. He spent hours with Mrs. Davenport, the elderly iron-willed widow of the town's founding banker, listening to her romanticized tales of the early days. He pored over the land deeds and business ledgers in the town records tracing the lines of wealth and influence. Bea was enchanted by him. "Isn't it wonderful, Mrs. Thornton?" she'd say, her eyes shining. "He's going to tell our story to the whole world." Esther would simply nod, a quiet worry taking root in her heart. She noticed who Mr. Croft wasn't talking to. He hadn't spoken to the hard-working farmers on the outskirts of town. He hadn't visited the Rodriguez family to ask about their history. He hadn't sought out the stories of the women, the midwives, the laundresses, the bakers. He was collecting facts, but he was missing the truth. The truth of his purpose became chillingly clear one afternoon when he visited the Daily Bread. He was charming, praising her baking and the central role her shop played in the town. "I understand, Mrs. Thornton, that you are something of a local institution," he said, smiling his pleasant smile. "I am told you knew nearly everyone who has lived and died in this town for the past 50 years. I have been blessed with many friends," Esther said simply. "Excellent," Croft said, pulling out a small leather-bound notebook. "I am currently writing a chapter on the founding fathers of the town, men like Judge Davenport and Mr. Miller, the first land agent. I would be grateful for any anecdotes you might have about their vision, their fortitude." Esther thought for a moment. "I remember Mr. Miller," she said. "He was a hard man. He foreclosed on the Henderson family farm during the bad winter of '67. They lost everything." Croft's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew cold. He made no note in his book. "I see. And Judge Davenport?" "A powerful man," Esther said. "He once had a man jailed for a month for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his children. The man's wife, Mary, had to take in washing to survive. I made sure she had bread every day. Mr. Croft closed his notebook with a soft snap. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Thornton, he said, his tone now clipped and cool. It seems your memories are focused more on the struggles than the triumphs. I am writing a history, not a book of grievances. My patron is interested in the story of how this town was built, not in the stories of those who failed to keep up. He turned and left, leaving Esther standing in her warm, fragrant kitchen, a cold chill settling deep in her bones. He was not a historian. He was a curator of a specific sanitized version of the past. He was here to erase the inconvenient truths, to silence the stories of the common man, to create a golden myth for his wealthy, unnamed patron. He was here to steal the town's soul. Chapter 3. The Recipe of a Lie. The incident crystallized Esther's fears into a certainty. She began to pay closer attention. She listened to the stories the townspeople told her, stories of their interviews with Mr. Croft. Old Man Hemlock. A farmer told her he had tried to tell Croft about the Great Flood of 71, how the whole town, rich and poor, had worked together to save the lower fields. Croft had seemed bored, changing the subject back to the financial history of the bank. Elena Rodriguez, the matriarch of her family, told Esther that she had offered to share her father's journals written in Spanish, detailing the building of the town's first irrigation ditch. Croft had politely declined, stating he was focusing on the primary English language sources. Esther saw the pattern. Croft was constructing a history that glorified the few and erased the many. He was taking the rich, complex tapestry of redemption and pulling out all but the golden threads, leaving a thin, brittle and false version of their shared life. The town, so flattered by his attention, couldn't see what was happening. They were so eager to have their story told that they didn't realize it was being stolen. The final straw came in the form of a conversation she overheard near the general store. She heard Mr. Croft speaking with Mayor Thompson. The first chapter is nearly complete, Croft was saying. It focuses on the visionary leadership of Judge Davenport. I've titled it, The Patriarch of Redemption. I've made the difficult but necessary editorial decision to omit the unfortunate suicide of his first wife. It's a tragic but ultimately irrelevant detail that would only serve to tarnish an otherwise exemplary legacy. Esther froze. She had known Judge Davenport's first wife, a fragile, gentle woman named Eleanor. She had not committed suicide. Esther knew, because Eleanor had confided in her during her last days, that she had died of a broken heart and a laudanum addiction, driven to despair by her husband's coldness and cruelty. Esther had been the one to bake a simple lavender-scented cake for the small private funeral, a cake Eleanor had loved. The recipe, Eleanor's lavender loaf, was in her ledger, a quiet testament to a hidden tragedy. To hear this woman's suffering dismissed as an irrelevant detail, to be omitted, was a desecration. It was a lie polished and presented as history. In that moment, Esther Thornton, the quiet baker, knew she could not stand by and do nothing. Her promise to her husband had been to nourish the town with bread. But she now understood that a town, like a person, could not live on bread alone. It needed the nourishment of truth. Chapter 4. The Harvest Table. That night, Esther could not sleep. She sat in her kitchen, the ledger open before her, the ghosts of her friends and neighbours whispering to her from its pages. How could she fight a man like Croft? He wielded the power of education, of wealth, of the written word. All she had were her recipes and her memories. And then she knew. That was her strength. It was the very thing he dismissed that held the true power. He could write a book of polished lies, but she could bake the truth. An idea bold and terrifying took shape in her mind. The annual town harvest festival was in 3 weeks. It was a day of celebration, of feasting, a day when the whole town came together. Mr. Croft, she had heard, was planning to give a public reading of his first chapter at the festival, a grand unveiling of his work. Esther decided she would host a celebration of her own, not in opposition but in parallel. She would set up a long table in the square right next to the speaker's platform. She would call it the Harvest Table of Remembrance. And on that table she would place not just food, but history. She would bake dozens of items from her ledger. Each one would have a small handwritten card next to it. She would bake the Rodriguez family's cornbread. The card would read, "This recipe was given by Miguel Rodriguez, who engineered the town's first irrigation ditch in 1865. She would bake Eleanor's lavender loaf." The card would read, "In memory of Eleanor Davenport, a kind and gentle soul." She would bake the Henderson foreclosure loaf, a simple, hearty potato bread. The card would read, "This bread sustained the Henderson family through the hard winter of 67. She would not make accusations. She would not argue. She would simply present the truth in the most undeniable elemental form she knew, as the food that had seen them through their lives. She would let the bread speak for itself." Chapter 5. Kneading the Rebellion. When Esther told Bea her plan, the young girl was frightened. "But Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Croft is so important, the mayor. Everyone supports him. They will be angry." Perhaps Esther said, her hands already kneading a large ball of dough, her movements firm and resolute. "But fear, child, is a poor baker. It makes the bread tough and tasteless. We must bake with courage." Inspired by Esther's quiet determination, Bea's fear gave way to loyalty. She became Esther's co-conspirator. Together they began the immense task of preparing for the harvest table. They spent their days baking and their evenings writing the story cards, their kitchen filled with the sense of defiance. Bea's role became crucial. She went to the families whose stories were being told. She visited Elena Rodriguez and asked for a photograph of her great-grandfather Miguel. She spoke to the grandson of the Henderson family, now a respected blacksmith, and asked him to share a memory of that hard winter. She was no longer just an apprentice baker. She was an apprentice historian gathering the oral history that Croft had dismissed. Word of Esther's project began to spread through the town. It was met with a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and from some quarters disapproval. Mayor Thompson, under the sway of Croft's influence, paid Esther a visit. "Now, Esther," he said, trying to sound both friendly and authoritative. "What's all this I hear about a competing table at the festival? Mr. Croft's reading is the main event. We don't want to create any confusion." "There will be no confusion," Mayor Esther said, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "Mr. Croft will offer the town his words. I will offer the town its bread. The people can decide for themselves which is more nourishing." Julian Croft, however, saw Esther's plan for exactly what it was: a direct challenge to his authority. He could not stop her openly, for she was too beloved. But he began a subtle campaign to undermine her. He would casually remark in the saloon that it was a shame Mrs. Thornton seemed to be living in the past. that her memory was perhaps not what it once was. He hinted to Mrs. Davenport that Esther's project was an attempt to dredge up old gossip and dishonor the town's founders. The town grew tense. You could feel the divide. It was the official history versus the people's history. It was the polished written word versus the warm, living bread. The Harvest Festival was no longer just a celebration. It was a battle for the soul of redemption. Chapter 6. The Day of the Feast. The day of the Harvest Festival arrived crisp and clear. The town square was filled with people. On one side, a podium had been set up for Julian Croft, a stack of his neatly bound manuscripts resting upon it. On the other side, under the shade of the great cottonwood tree, was Esther's harvest table. It was a sight to behold. A long table draped in white linen, groaning under the weight of dozens of different breads, cakes, pies, and cookies. Each item was accompanied by a small handwritten card, and in some cases, a faded photograph or a small memento provided by a family. The aroma from the table was intoxicating, a symphony of all the best scents of home and memory. The festival began. People milled about their loyalties torn. Many were drawn to the grandeur of Croft's podium, eager to hear the heroic story of their town. But just as many drawn by the irresistible aroma and a deep, quiet curiosity drifted towards Esther's table. They began to read the cards. A woman gasped softly as she saw a pie and a card that read, "Sarah Gable's Apple and Thyme Pie." She brought one to every new mother in town for 20 years. An old man smiled, his eyes misty, as he pointed to a dark seeded loaf. "That's my father's bread. I haven't tasted that since I was a boy." Esther and Bea didn't just serve the food. They served the stories. "Try a piece of this," Esther would say to a group. "This is the railroad contract sourdough. We baked it to celebrate when the railroad decided to build its station here and not in the next town over. It was a victory for all of us." People began to talk, to share their own memories sparked by the food. The Rodriguez family stood proudly by their cornbread, telling stories of their great-grandfather. The Henderson blacksmith stood by the potato bread, speaking not of hardship, but of the way the community had helped his family survive. Esther's table was becoming a living, breathing forum of shared history. It was loud, chaotic, emotional, and deeply, undeniably real. Chapter 7. The Taste of Truth. From his podium. Julian Croft watched with growing alarm. His audience was thinning. The center of gravity in the square was shifting away from him and toward the humble baker's table. With an air of forced confidence, he tapped the microphone and began his reading. His voice, rich and practiced, boomed across the square. He read his first chapter, The Patriarch of Redemption, V. It was a magnificent piece of prose filled with heroic descriptions of Judge Davenport's foresight and strength. But in the context of the day, his words, which had once seemed so impressive, now sounded hollow. He spoke of the judge's grand vision, but the people were tasting the potato bread that reminded them of the judge's harshness. He praised the judge's unblemished legacy, but they were looking at the lavender loaf that spoke of his wife's hidden sorrow. When he finished his reading, the applause was polite but sparse. The heart of the town was at the other table. Unable to accept defeat, Croft strode over to Esther's table, his face a mask of condescending anger. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "this is a charming display, a delightful collection of kitchen gossip and sentimental trifles. but it is not history. History is a serious discipline based on documented facts, not on the nostalgic ramblings of old women. The crowd fell silent. Esther wiped her hands on her apron and faced him, her expression not angry, but filled with a deep, weary pity. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and calm. "You are right. Your book is made of documented facts. But a house is not a home just because it is made of bricks, and a town's story is not its truth just because it is written on paper. You have the facts, sir, but we have the memories. And here in Redemption, our memories have a taste." She picked up a piece of the Rodriguez family's cornbread and held it out to him. "This," she said, "tastes of innovation and hard work. It tastes of a family who helped build this town. That is a truth you will not find in any of your land deeds." She then picked up a small, simple cookie. "And this," she said, her voice softening, "tastes of a mother's love for her sick child. That is a truth more powerful than any banker's ledger." She looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, who were watching, their eyes shining with understanding and pride. "This table is our history, not the history of a few great men, but the history of all of us. It is the story of our daily bread." Julian Croft stood there speechless. He looked from the simple food to the faces of the townspeople, and he finally understood. He had been defeated. Not by an argument, but by a community remembering its own soul. His polished words were no match for the undeniable taste of truth. He turned and without another word walked away from the table, away from the festival. His grand project turned to dust. Chapter 8. The Legacy. The departure of Julian Croft was not the end, but a new beginning. The town awakened to the value of its own authentic story, rallied. They decided to create their own history, not as a single formal book, but as a living project. The town council asked Esther to lead the effort. Bea, with her bright mind and her deep love for the town's stories, became the official scribe. They started the Redemption Road Recipe Project. Families from all over the valley brought their old recipes and the stories that went with them. The recipe ledger grew filled with new voices, new memories. The Daily Bread became more than just a bakery. It became the town's heart and its archive, a place where the past was not just remembered, but tasted, shared, and kept alive. Chapter 9. The Nook. Years later, Esther Thornton, now well into her 70s, sat in her familiar rocking chair by the bakery's warm oven. She watched as Bea, now a confident young woman and a master baker in her own right, showed her own young daughter how to knead dough, her hands guiding the child's, just as Esther's had once guided hers. The legacy was secure. The bakery, this small, warm nook of the world, was safe. It would continue to nourish the town, not just with bread, but with the truth of who they were, a truth baked into the very heart of every loaf. Esther closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of baking bread, cinnamon, and memory. It was the smell of a life well lived, of a community well loved, of a story that would never be forgotten. And it was good. Thank you for joining us for today's tale at the Story Nook. We believe that the truest histories are not always found in books, but in the shared meals, the quiet memories, and the loving hands that sustain a community. If this story warmed your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories. We'll be here waiting for you in our next chapter.